In World War II, the most powerful weapon at sea wasn't the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It was a flat deck packed with planes that could strike hundreds of miles away and disappear before the enemy ever saw a ship. That floating airfield, the aircraft carrier, quietly killed the battleship era and rewrote naval warfare in just a few bloody years. But here's the problem. When people hear World War II carriers, they usually picture just a couple of famous names, maybe Enterprise, maybe Akagi, and miss the insane variety of designs, roles, and trade-offs that actually decided battles from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So in this video, we're going to speed run the most important carrier types of the war. From tiny baby flat tops escorting convoys, to armored British beasts, to sleek Japanese strike carriers built purely for offense. By the end, you'll see how completely different philosophies went to war on the same ocean. Let's start at the smallest end of the spectrum, the escort carriers. These ships weren't glamorous, they weren't fast, and a lot of the sailors who served on them joked that they were basically floating coffins. But they were absolutely essential. Take the Casablanca class. On paper, they look almost unimpressive, about 156 meters long, around 8,200 tons standard displacement, and a single reciprocating steam engine pushing them to just 19 knots, too slow to hang with the big fleet carriers and battle groups. They carried roughly 27 aircraft, a mix of Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers. Defenses, one 5-inch gun, some 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Not exactly a floating fortress. So why did these ships matter so much? Because the US could build them faster than almost anything else afloat. Industrialist Henry Kaiser took the rapid build techniques used for Liberty cargo ships and applied them to warships. A fleet carrier like an Essex might take 20 months to complete. A Casablanca? Around 3. In just 21 months, the US turned out 50 of them, the most numerous carrier class in history. Crews called them Kaiser's coffins, combustible, vulnerable, expendable. They were small, lightly protected, and often sent straight into danger. But they were there when bigger ships simply couldn't be spared. They ferried aircraft, covered amphibious landings, ran anti-submarine patrols, and provided air support where no Essex-class carrier was available. Their finest hour came in one of the most insane naval actions of the war, the Battle off Samar in October 1944. A tiny task unit nicknamed Taffy 3, built around 6 of these baby Casablancas and a few destroyers and destroyer escorts, suddenly found itself facing a Japanese force that included battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, plus cruisers and destroyers. On paper, it should have been a massacre. The escort carriers had mostly anti-submarine aircraft, not heavy anti-ship weapons. But their pilots launched everything they had: machine guns, small bombs, depth charges, anything that could damage or distract. The destroyers made suicidal torpedo runs. Smoke screens went up. Confusion reigned. Against all odds, this tiny outgunned force managed to convince the Japanese commander that he was facing a major fleet and forced him to turn away. Yes, some Casablanca-class carriers were lost. Torpedoes, gunfire, kamikaze hits. Not one of them survived past the war. They were all scrapped, victims of their rushed construction and outdated engines. But their impact in those crucial years was far from expendable. They were the cheap, scrappy backbone that allowed the US to project air power everywhere at once. Now shift over to another workhorse escort type, the Bogue class. These started life not as warships at all, but as merchant hulls, C-3 cargo ships. The US needed more carriers, fast after Pearl Harbor. So shipyards took these cargo hulls and converted them into small carriers. The result? About 150 meters long, roughly 9,800 tons, around 18 knots top speed. They could carry maybe 20 to 24 aircraft, fighters plus anti-submarine planes. While the Casablancas became icons of the Pacific, the Bogue class made their name in the Atlantic. Their job there was brutal and simple: protect convoys from German U-boats. In hunter-killer groups, a Bogue-class carrier and its escorts would roam the ocean independently, using radar-equipped aircraft to find submarines, then coordinating attacks with ships and planes. These little carriers quietly helped turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic, chalking up U-boat kills and making the ocean a much more dangerous place for German submarines. They also did double duty. Some supported operations like the North Africa landings and Mediterranean campaigns. After the war, many were converted back into merchant roles or scrapped. They had done their job as emergency wartime platforms, but they proved that you could take a merchant design and turn it into a surprisingly effective combat carrier. Okay, that's the small stuff. Let's step up to the heavyweights, the Essex class, the true punch of the U.S. Navy's carrier power. Design work on Essex began around 1939, once naval treaty limits started to loosen. Without those old restrictions, American designers went bigger and more powerful. The result, a carrier roughly 266 meters long, around 27,000 tons standard displacement, driven by 4 turbines with a combined 150,000 horsepower. Top speed? About 33 knots, fast enough to run with battleships and cruiser screens. The flight deck alone stretched about 262 meters, with multiple elevators and catapults to move and launch aircraft efficiently. And Essex could carry on the order of 90 to 100 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, all organized into large coordinated strike groups. This wasn't a support ship. It was a floating main offensive weapon. Protection was respectable too. They didn't adopt a fully armored flight deck like the British would, but they did have an armored hangar deck and internal armor belts, plus heavy subdivision to survive damage. Anti-aircraft armament ramped up as the war went on. 5-inch dual-purpose guns, then more and more 40mm and 20mm guns as kamikaze attacks increased. These ships formed the backbone of the fast carrier task forces in the Pacific from 1943 onward. Think of every major late-war carrier battle, the Philippine Sea Marianas Turkey Shoot, Leyte Gulf, raids across the Japanese home islands, and you'll find Essex-class carriers at the center. They took brutal hits and kept going. Ships like USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill were savaged by bomb and kamikaze attacks, suffering horrific casualties and catastrophic fires. Yet through disciplined damage control and design, they stayed afloat and made it home. Not a single Essex-class carrier was lost in combat during World War II. These weren't just war-winning ships, they were era-defining. After the war, many Essex carriers were modernized with angled flight decks, steam catapults, and new electronics to fly jets. They served in Korea, Vietnam, and into the Cold War. Some survive today as museum ships, physical reminders that these weren't just steel hulls. They were floating cities that changed history. Now let's look at something smaller, faster, and more improvisational. The Independence-class light carriers. Picture this as the Navy saying, "We need more decks now. What can we convert?" The answer, Cleveland-class light cruisers. Shipyards took partially built cruisers, chopped off the superstructures, and built flight decks on top. The result, carriers about 189 meters long, around 11,000 tons, with the original cruiser machinery still underneath, which meant they were fast, pushing over 31 knots. Because they were built on relatively narrow hulls, they had less room than a purpose-built carrier. They carried maybe 30 to 35 aircraft, usually fighters and torpedo bombers. 2 elevators, a single catapult, and tight hangar space meant operations were more limited than on an Essex class. Crews were crammed into spaces originally meant for a different type of warship. But speed is life at sea. These light carriers could run with the fast task forces, adding extra decks and extra squadrons to the strike package. Individually, each Independence-class ship didn't bring a huge air group, but when several operated together, their combined aircraft represented a serious punch. They saw action in major Pacific campaigns, raids on island strongholds, support for amphibious landings and fleet battles. They weren't invincible. USS Princeton was lost at Leyte Gulf after bomb hits triggered devastating internal explosions. Others were battered and later repurposed or passed on to Allied navies after the war. Still, the Independence class proved you could take a cruiser and, with clever engineering, turn it into a highly effective light carrier. So far, we've mostly been on the American side, but the British Royal Navy had its own very distinct approach to carriers. And nowhere is that clearer than in the illustrious class. Where the US prioritized big air groups and offensive striking power, the British designers were obsessed with survivability. They had watched ships get hammered by bombs in confined waters, like the Mediterranean, and knew their carriers would often fight under heavy air attack close to enemy land-based aircraft. So the illustrious class carriers were built with heavily armored flight decks, literal armor plating integrated into the ship's structure, around 3 inches thick over key areas. The idea was simple. If the enemy drops bombs on your deck, you'd rather have them blow up topside than tear through into your hangars and fuel stores. The tiny Casablancas, the converted Bogues, the sleek Independence Lights, the heavy-hitting Essexes, the armored Illustrious class, the elegant Shikaku class. You start to see World War II carrier warfare as a clash of philosophies. The US leaned into mass production, big air groups, and flexible designs it could upgrade and churn out by the dozen. Britain bet on armored survivability and smaller but tougher carriers. Japan pursued high-performance strike carriers with elite air crews, hoping quality and aggression could overcome industrial disadvantage. And in between, hastily converted cargo hulls and cruisers filled the gaps, proving that in total war, even second-rate designs can become absolutely critical. This is just part one of the story. We've only scratched the surface of the full cast of World War II carriers. There are still more Japanese classes, oddball German and Italian attempts, and the evolution of escort and light carriers to cover. But you can already see the pattern. The war at sea stopped being about who had the biggest battleship and started being about who controlled the sky above the ocean. If you could step onto the deck of just one of these carriers at the height of the war, a cramped Casablanca in the middle of a typhoon, a roaring Essex launching full strikes at dawn, a battle-scarred Illustrious after a bombing raid, or a Shokaku-class carrier racing into battle in the early days of the Pacific War, which would you choose and why? Let me know down in the comments which carrier class fascinated you the most, what ship you want to see covered in the next part. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this World War II carrier deep dive.